We're back today with Dr. Abigail Marsh to follow up on our discussion of altruism in non-directed donors. And we also have Dr. Tyler Branagan joining us. Dr. Branagan is Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at CU Anschutz and Director of Psychological Services in the Division of Transplant. And Dr. Abigail Marsh is Professor of Psychology at Georgetown University. Welcome. Thank you both for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Marsh, for coming back for a second interview.
My pleasure.
For having me.
Let's start out with you, Dr. Branagan. Can you tell us a little bit about your role in Division of Transplant and what you do?
Sure. I'm one of two psychologists at the UC Health Transplant Center, and our role is really to perform evaluations on patients prior to organ transplant. And so this includes our living donors as well as our recipients. And we see patients from all different organ groups that are transplanted at the University of Colorado. So that includes living liver and kidney donors, kidney and pancreas recipients, heart recipients, liver recipients, and lung recipients.
And today we're going to talk mostly about non-directed donors. You see non-directed donors both for kidney and liver. Is that correct?
Yep, that's right.
All right. And Dr. Marsh, your research has been about altruism in non-directed kidney donors, right?
Yes, mostly kidney donors, but I've also done research with marrow donors and a few altruistic liver donors.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about your research? And in particular, I'm interested to hear about the brain imaging research, but also anything else you'd like to mention?
Sure. My interest in understanding altruism goes back, 10 or 12 years now. And I was really frustrated with the limitations of understanding altruism by trying to concoct experiments in the laboratory that would elicit altruistic behavior in people, because of course, ethical limitations mean that we can't really put people in the position of serious risk in the lab. And to me, the most significant acts of altruism are those that help people who are in serious risk. So there's just fundamental problems with that approach. So I started thinking about trying to understand altruism better by using what you could call like a clinical approach, which means finding people in the real world who are unusually altruistic and then inviting them to come to the lab to see if there are differences between them and people who have not done such altruistic things. And at the time, altruistic kidney donation was just starting to take off in terms of how widely known about it was, how many donations were happening per year. Fewer transplant centers were forbidding non-directed donations, although at the time, quite a few still did. And so I didn't think it would be possible, honestly, to do the kind of research I hope to do with altruistic kidney donors because there were so few. At the time, there were fewer than 1,000 in the whole United States. I didn't know how I would find them. I didn't know if any of them would be interested in coming in to be, quote unquote, guinea pigs in my research. And I was totally wrong. It was shockingly easy because it turns out that people who are altruistic kidney donors are people who really like helping other people. And I just could not then and still really cannot believe how helpful and generous with their time the altruistic donors I've worked with have been. And so for the last 10 or 12 years, I've been doing both brain imaging and behavioral research with people who have donated kidneys, a part of their liver or marrow, and have found, I won't summarize all of the research here now, but one of the things we found and sort of our earliest and I think in some ways most interesting finding is that people who are very altruistic look the opposite of people who are psychopathic in terms of both their behavior, their emotional responding to other people, and also their brain structure and function. So for example, people who are psychopathic, who are really lacking in empathy and compassion and the desire to help other people, have a brain structure called the amygdala that tends to be smaller than average and less responsive than average to the sight of other people in distress. So for example, if I show you a picture of somebody looking afraid, somebody who's psychopathic would show a very small response to that. Whereas people who are very altruistic have amygdalas that are larger than average, and their amygdalas are more responsive than average to the sight of somebody else in distress, which I think may be one reason they're motivated to help.
So a couple questions there. Can you clarify when you use the term psychopathic? You said lacking in empathy. Is there more to that term? What do you mean when you say psychopathic?
There's so much more to that term. Yes. Yes. So psychopathy is a really poorly understood disorder, partly because there isn't as much research devoted to it as I hope someday there will be. But yeah, people who are psychopathic, their core deficit seems to be a lack of care for other people. They really don't care about other people's welfare, fundamentally. That actually seems to be the wellspring of their lack of empathy. So if I think now, based on the research I've been doing the last few years, that empathy is a result of care. If you care about somebody else's welfare when they're suffering, you will experience empathy for them. And if you don't care about them when they're suffering, you won't have an empathic response. And so, but that's not the only thing that makes somebody psychopathic. So we think of it as a personality condition that has sort of three main parts. One is being uncaring, callous, or mean. The second is having a personality that's sort of fearless and bold and socially dominant. And the third is being disinhibited, so not controlling your impulses well, tending to live moment to moment or day to day. And so when you have an impulse to do something antisocial, you have difficulty restraining it. And if you have all three of those traits, we tend to call you psychopathic.
Thank you. So two-part question. You say that the brain imaging shows kind of opposite in people who are psychopathic and people who are altruistic kidney donors. Do you find that characteristics or personality traits are also somewhat opposite? So that's the first part of the question. And then the second part of the question is, what have you found to be key characteristics or personality traits of non-directed or altruistic donors?
Yeah, this was a harder question to answer than I thought it would be initially, mostly because a lot of self-report scales used in psychology are not as reliable as one might hope, because sometimes they're too transparent. And so people are more likely to answer based on what they think they're supposed to say, maybe, or at least their responses are influenced by what they think they're supposed to say. So for example, we use self-report empathy measures in some of our studies. So how empathic do you think you are? How empathic would you rate yourself to be? And interestingly, we don't find huge correspondence between those measures and how psychopathic versus altruistic somebody is. However, we did a huge study that was just published last year looking at it was over 100 kidney donors, both directed and non-directed, as well as another 200 altruists who were marrow donors, heroic rescuers, humanitarian aid workers for Doctors Without Borders. Let's see, did I say marrow donors? Yeah, I think that was all the groups. Anyways, there's over 300 people that we would consider extraordinary altruists, meaning they do something very unusual aimed at helping other people that they don't know. And we compared them to hundreds of typical adults on tons and tons of different personality metrics. And what was interesting is that we didn't find any difference between the altruist and the controls on most measures of risk assessment. So the altruists were no sort of more impervious to risk, no more insensitive to risk, including medical and physical risk, although they were a little less sensitive to social risk. So breaking convention, which I thought was interesting, making people think you might be odd by doing something unusual. So that kind of makes sense. But they're not people who were throwing themselves off cliffs or out of airplanes. They also didn't really differ in self-reported empathy. Certainly not the kinds of empathy we tend to associate with altruism, like, oh, I feel really bad when I see somebody suffering. Again, I think that people who are altruistic are more empathic, but those scales are not that good at picking up on that trait. The study didn't find any difference between altruists and other adults in personality traits like agreeableness, like how nice you seem on the surface, right? How sort of much you avoid conflict and how much you kind of go along to get along. Or another trait, conscientiousness, right? How much you kind of try to do the right thing and try to follow the rules and try to be self-disciplined. The only traits that really distinguish altruists from other adults reliably across all the groups of altruists, and like by a lot, were traits related to unselfishness. So this included a personality trait called honesty, humility. I hate the name, but that's what it's called. And really what that trait indexes is the degree to which you value people for their own sake versus believe it's okay to exploit people to benefit yourself. And people who are highly psychopathic are very low on that trait. They don't care about other people's welfare intrinsically, and they do think it's fine to exploit people to benefit themselves because they think they're more important than other people. Altruists are much lower on that trait than are typical adults. They do not believe it's okay to exploit people, and they do intrinsically value other people's welfare. And then we had a couple other assessments that just backed up that finding, including sort of an economic task that we use where people are asked to make decisions about how to allocate small amounts of money between themselves and other people. And we validated this task in other studies. I won't bore anybody with the details, but suffice to say, this task captures how much people subjectively value other people's welfare. And the altruists very consistently respond in ways that suggest they subjectively just truly value other people's welfare more than the average person. So, I mean, the short explanation is they're just less selfish. They genuinely care about other people more. And what's nice about that is it suggests that their altruism reflects their true values, right? This isn't some, they're not suppressing their selfish urges more than other people. They're not, interested in looking good more than other people. They're not subverting their values by being altruistic. They're simply, I think, expressing their values.
Dr. Branagan, does this resonate? Does this correspond to what you see in donors here at CU?
It does. One thing that I was thinking about is how sometimes typical our life donors appear to be whenever you meet with them and you talk to them. There doesn't seem to be anything that's so extraordinary about them. And sometimes it's in part because of the matter-of-fact way that they talk about their desire to donate. Like, well, of course I want to do this. This is what ought to be done. But then at the same time, it's also just the presentation and the type of people that they are, that they could be the person who's, next to you watching, here in Colorado, the Broncos game or something like that. And that they've had the opportunity to be confronted with a need. And then for some reason, they appear to have the attribute of thinking, well, I'm the one to do this, that why not do this? And to be the person who moves towards the problem to address it. And it's not necessarily that they're more conscientious, and oftentimes actually maybe they're not very agreeable people. They kind of like to set out and direct their own life and want to act in a way that is fulfilling for them and not necessarily for the benefit of everyone else. But that's that they're presented with this opportunity to donate. And the thing that always sticks out to me is the sense of, it's not quite a sense of duty, but a sense of that I can be the one to make this difference.
So it sounds like a sense of the ability to make change, or I don't know quite how to say this, a sense of having a capacity to do something. They maybe don't feel helpless like other people might feel helpless.
Right. And then the personality assessment that we use, which is categorically a different type of personality assessment because it's more focused on mental health factors and pathology and looking for mental health or mental distress. This shows up in our scale. And when we look at a sample of, the over 1,500 donors that we've evaluated using this measure, and we look at the T-score of the grandiosity scale, it's about one standard deviation above what the normative sample would be. And so it's not in a range that's so pathological like maybe someone with psychopathic traits would have, where, they're thinking, they make statements like, I alone can fix it. But it would instead be something along the lines of like, well, I could be the one to help in this situation. And so thinking that they have the capability to do it, the desire to do it, and also a sense of purpose and donating too.
So maybe an effective sort of grandiosity.
Yeah.
Okay.
And a healthy sense of grandiosity. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I also think it's funny that you use the term not very agreeable. And when I think about myself, I'd say that resonates. I mean, I get along with people well, but I also like to do my own thing. And I would say I'm not probably swayed too much by what's conventional. So in that sense, that resonates in terms of not being agreeable, not necessarily going with what everybody else thinks is the right thing to do.
I think that can help a donor in some cases, because oftentimes they have family members or other people in their lives who are very concerned about their well-being going forward with donation and thinking about the risk to that person. but they make their own determination and develop their own reasons for going forward with donation and assuming the small risk to donate.
Yeah. Do you see or think there's any difference between people who are non-directed kidney donors versus non-directed liver donors versus people who do both?
I think that there might be a difference in people who do both in the sense of the reasons for donating. Oftentimes when people are looking to donate a solitary, have a single instance of donation, whether a liver or a kidney, they maybe have an identified person. In the case of people donating a liver and kidney, it's almost always that in one situation, it's a non-directed donation. And I do think that there are some attributes of and the reasoning that people develop around donating non-directed that maybe there's a higher degree of altruism. Although I do think that all people who donate organs are altruistic and engage in an altruistic behavior that way. I think that with the thinking and the assessment of the risk, I sometimes hear folks who come in for liver donation and they say, well, I'm really drawn to the fact that there's a regeneration, and so I will have a fully functioning organ. And while I will, with kidney donation, have sufficient functioning with a solitary kidney, there's still a longer term theoretical risk in having a solitary kidney versus a fully functioning liver. And so sometimes they think about it that way, where the surgery for liver donation is more involved. There's a higher risk in the surgical stage. So there's a higher immediate risk, but perhaps a lower risk in the long term.
Well, there's several things there I want to come back to, but I also want to go back to something you said, Dr. Marsh. Can you say more about why transplant centers were forbidding non-directed donation, and why?
My understanding from reading the literature as I was writing up my book, which delved into this topic, is that it was generally believed, including by many psychiatrists and transplant professionals at the time, that it was almost impossible for a person to be that altruistic, that somebody would, that it was pathological by default, I believe was one of the quotations I remember, for somebody to want to give a kidney to a stranger for no reason. That the only reason somebody would volunteer to do such a thing is because they were expecting some sort of payment or other, concrete benefit from donating, or because they literally were irrational. They were not able to rationally make this decision that somehow altruism and rationality are not compatible. But, I think perceptions change over time, luckily. And that's been true for all different kinds of medical altruism over the years. Once upon a time, we did not have an all-volunteer blood supply in the United States. People were paid to empty their veins to give blood to strangers. And in many places in the world, that's still true. And only over time did people come to think that, maybe people, that it's compatible with human nature for people to want to help other people just because they have the ability to. And I think that's consistent with sort of growing acceptance and awareness of marrow donation and other forms of tissue and organ donation as well.
So, Dr. Branagan, do you still see some of this perception that there must be something pathological about altruistic donation?
Yeah, to pull the curtain back on us transplant providers, it's not a belief that I personally hold, but I think that there are sometimes our discussions that we have. And of course, when we discuss cases, we're talking about groups of, up to 20 people discussing cases, whether from a variety of disciplines. And so you have, transplant surgeons and medical practitioners, dietitians, social workers. And of course, each of those groups has their own inclusion criteria for personality features. And so I think that sometimes there is moments where we're all looking at a case and maybe the notion really is, well, gosh, I wouldn't do that. And so when that feeling comes up, we start trying to think and empathize with the position of the donor and to think about what their reasons are and whether or not those reasons make sense to us individually. But I think that, especially one thing I really appreciate about all the providers at the University of Colorado is that they're really able to understand the perspective of the donor and to understand their reasons as their reasons, and those reasons are good enough.
Have you seen that perspective evolve over time, even over the past few years?
Absolutely. I've been doing evaluations now I've been at the transplant center for 7 years. And when we started, I think we would only take donors as young as 25. So the kind of rental car threshold of the prefrontal cortex development. And, we really started to think more critically about it. And then we had, some donors who were directed who were 20 and 19. And then in talking with them, you're going, gosh, these people are much more mature than potentially some 50-year-olds that we see. And so the depth of their thinking and their reasoning really pushed us towards thinking more critically about age as a cutoff. And so now, of course, we will see donors as young as 18. And I think that we also all challenged ourselves to empathize and think more critically about what are appropriate reasons for donation. And that as long as someone understands the boundaries and accepts the ethics of donation, including respecting the autonomy of the recipient, that oftentimes that's the line that we look for is whether or not they can uphold the ethics of being a donor.
Well, Dr. Marsh, one of the things you asked me was whether I did it seeking honor or praise. And Dr. Branagan, I'm curious, do you see people wanting to donate and that seems to be their primary motive?
I have evaluated a psychopath for a living donation. Unfortunately, the traits that fall along with psychopathy, especially at a certain degree, can exclude someone from donation, including not being able to appreciate the risk, concerns about adherence post-operatively, and whether or not they can accept the medical recommendations. And then also being not boundary crossing. And so what I was talking about with the understanding the ethics and the autonomy and respecting that of the recipient, that would be difficult for a person who has psychopathic traits. And so I have seen people who are thinking about donation potentially as a way to rectify a relationship that they have or to get notoriety and recognition. And while it's certainly acceptable for people to talk about their donation, we want people to get the word out there about donation, it needs to happen at the appropriate time and place and in the appropriate manner so that it respects all the parties involved.
So what you're saying is that sometimes people may put themselves forward and they do seem to be seeking sort of notoriety or fame or praise, but they generally would have other characteristics that would make them not be ideal donors.
Absolutely. And it's usually the other characteristics that become direct contraindications as well. But the notoriety and the fame could be a barrier in and of itself. We've also had donors who have made mistakes before in their life and felt that by donating, they could help heal some of the pain that they've caused to society. And they would wish to remain completely anonymous and wouldn't want any of that notoriety to come to them in any way. And so they were doing it really in part for an internal process. And, that's where we have these very nuanced discussions, and it comes down to case by case situations and really making an assessment about the safety of it. But as far as people have many different narratives that they bring to the table in donation.
Well, and that makes me think of something, Dr. Marsh, that you've talked about in your book. So, Dr. Branagan, you're talking about people who might have done something considered bad by society, who later are wanting to do something good to help with their healing or to give back to society. And Dr. Marsh, one of the things you talk about is sometimes people who are psychopathic and have underactive amygdalas can look like people who are actually very sensitive, but have led a path in life where they have also engaged in violent behaviors. And I'm curious if you can say more about, do you have thoughts about what leads someone to be very sensitive to other suffering, but become violent versus becoming altruistic?
Sure. There are a lot of different pathways to any given behavioral outcome in people, I think. And I would probably argue that the majority of violent behavior is not committed by people who are psychopathic. A lot of it is committed in moments of high emotion that are not necessarily due to an absence of caring or compassion, but due to anger or other strong emotions. Sometimes, aggression is done in self-defense or even perceived self-defense that to somebody else wouldn't seem justifiable, but to you in the moment does seem justifiable. So there are all kinds of reasons that people who are typical in their ability to feel care and compassion would still be aggressive or violent. And the average person would feel a lot of guilt after that, obviously. And guilt is what we call a pro-social emotion because it is very useful. It can help us avoid engaging in the kind of behavior that will cause us to feel guilt. And it doesn't surprise me that there are people who have made mistakes. They've done things in not their best moments that they feel guilty about and paying it back, or paying it forward, I guess. Trying to do something good to make amends for what they've done actually seems like a pretty understandable response in somebody who is a caring or compassionate person. I would consider it a little bit more self-focused motive. When we did an assessment of people who had signed up to donate kidneys here at Georgetown, so this includes people who had signed up for all different kinds of reasons to donate to all different kinds of recipients, and then tracked the ones that actually went on to donate versus those who were not ruled out for medical reasons, but ended up opting out of donating. And the people who were the most likely to follow through with donating to a stranger were people whose reason for donating, or at least that they put in the online form, focused on the other person somehow. It was something about how this would benefit them. They need it, it will save a life, something focusing on the other person. And the more self-focused the rationale was, the less likely they were to follow through, which I think is consistent with the general idea that altruistic donation is about valuing the other person's welfare. When it comes to people who are less compassionate or caring, people who are psychopathic, they are oftentimes, people who have these personality traits will do very pro-social things to help other people for a whole range of reasons. Sometimes it's because of a lack of fear of the consequences. Sometimes it's the desire for some other positive benefit that they expect the pro-social behavior will yield, but it's almost always for some instrumental reason, right? I'm not doing it just for the heck of it. I'm not doing it because I hope to benefit the other person. I'm doing it because I think it will benefit me somehow down the line in some way. And I assume that is something that transplant professionals try to rule out when they're screening people.
This whole idea of unselfishness is interesting to me because I think I talked about one of the things that felt good about donating to me was that, I tend to be almost hyper aware of badness in this world, and it feels good to be able to do something to alleviate suffering. And so, there's part of me that thinks, well, feeling good to do something, isn't that in and of itself selfish? It's not a tangible outcome down the road, but it, my brain feels good when I help people. So why isn't that classified as a sort of selfishness? Or is it?
Oh, some people do. I mean, there are definitely people out there who will say, I think there's a whole Friends episode about this, actually, that, if you feel good after you help somebody, then it was selfish the whole time. And, I think, and I have run into plenty of people who make this argument, well, if helping other people feels good, which it does, well, it was selfish. And my response to that is a couple of things. First of all, it leads you to a pretty illogical place if you really take that to its conclusion, which is that the most altruistic person is somebody who helps begrudgingly and, against their, it feels really unhappy and miserable about having helped, right? That then becomes the most altruistic person, which doesn't make any sense. The more sort of formal philosophical position relates to something called the doctrine of double effect, which means the ethics of a behavior are related to not just the outcome, but the intended outcome. And so if feeling good as a result of donating is a foreseeable outcome, but not the intended goal of helping, those are very different things from an ethical perspective. And so it's perfectly consistent with the idea of altruism for somebody to feel good after helping, even if that wasn't the intended goal. I think the philosopher and neuroscientist Matthew Ricard, who wrote a beautiful book called Altruism, put it best when he, and I have to paraphrase him because it's a long quote, basically said that taking pleasure in helping others is not the opposite of altruism. It's intrinsic to what it means to be altruistic, right? If we weren't altruistic, why would we find pleasure in helping other people?
I like that. And Dr. Branagan, I see you nodding. Do you have thoughts to add?
Yeah, I was thinking that if And donors come in and say, well, there's risk in everything. There's risk in going to the grocery store, and there's risk in, getting onto a plane to go visit family. And while that's true, all risks are not equal. Are the roads icy like they are today in Denver? Well, you have to go to a grocery store to get food. And I think that if someone were coming in and seeking to donate and they said, I really don't care at all what happens to me, I have no care, all I care about is the outcome for the other person, I think I would probably feel more concerned about that person becoming a donor than someone saying, it's going to feel so great waking up after my surgery and hearing that the recipient, even whether I know them or not, is doing well and is recovering well, and I'll get so much benefit. That will be enough for me to just know that that person's doing well. I think that the person who has no care at all about their own bodily integrity and health would concern me more.
That makes sense. Well, Dr. Marsh, I want to come back to a term you used earlier. You used the term extraordinary altruist. What do you mean by that? What's extraordinary altruism versus regular altruism?
I mean, in the very most basic sense, it means out of the ordinary. So not something that we would see most people doing day to day. It's something that is very rare, something that wouldn't be considered an obligatory form of altruism. Many people view giving some amount of their income to charity or engaging in some sort of volunteer work as something everybody is supposed to do. Whereas very few people would view it as obligatory to put one's own life at risk, rescuing a stranger from drowning or donating a kidney to somebody that you don't know.
So how common is extraordinary altruism? And is it something that can be increased?
Absolutely. Once upon a time, donating blood to a stranger would have been within the range of what we consider extraordinary. And over time has become more and more sort of a standard thing that people do, especially interestingly in times of national disaster. Blood banks will generally see donations spike after some well-publicized national emergency, even on, far away from the emergency. It's not like the blood is going to those victims, but it's something people like to do to feel that they can help. And, living kidney and liver donations, may never become commonplace exactly, but I do think the incidence is going up, and certainly the acceptance of these kinds of donations is going up. And I wonder if it might be someday that we consider them more similar to a marrow or stem cell donation than we do now. So at this point, I think people who donate marrow and stem cells to other people, including strangers, are not seen as having done anything that out of the ordinary. It's wonderful. I 100% encourage everybody to sign up to be a marrow or stem cell donor. It's a really, in some ways, easy way to save a life. And the risk is very low. And I think people just generally think that's a good and great thing to do. And I think if we can, bring the risk down from kidney and liver donation to be comparably low, I think it might become as common as that.
This is maybe a bit of a philosophical question and a question we can't answer, but if it does become as common as blood donation, would you expect then that the brains wouldn't look quite as different as they do now?
Well, I would think that because a wider range of people would do it, you would get a wider range of, and I do want to have a huge asterisk in here to say that, we cannot diagnose somebody as altruistic based on a brain scan yet at all, sure, because our scanning technology is still very clunky compared to what the non-human animal neuroscientists are able to do. And what we're picking up on when we, measure the volume of a structure like the amygdala is 1,000 different things. So, it's an imperfect technology. I will be the first one to agree. But, let's assume that we could pick up on exactly what is making somebody altruistic in the brain. The more and more common the behavior becomes, by default, the wider a range of people will be engaging in it. So I think of altruistic sort of urges and motivation as a continuum in the population. And right now, donating an organ to a stranger is still seen as rare enough and potentially risky enough that only people at the very high end of the continuum, I think, are willing to consider this behavior. But I think as it becomes more normative, more accepted, and perceived as sort of just the right thing to do, I think the range of people who would engage in that behavior would grow and, it would look a lot more like the typical person.
So what do you think we can do to increase that range and make it more normative and more commonplace?
Well, things like this show is a really good one. I think it's really great for people to just hear about altruistic organ donation as just a thing that people do. It's not that rare. Almost everybody probably knows somebody, or at least knows somebody who knows somebody who's donated a kidney to somebody. It's amazing how many people are out there that you might not know are donors. And I think just demystifying it, making it clear that the desire to help other people doesn't make you weird. You wouldn't be surprised how many donors, and well, Rachel, you wouldn't be surprised how many people out there do think it's a little weird still to want to give a kidney to a stranger.
Yeah.
And I've certainly heard of transplant professionals, from some of the donors I've worked with, mostly a while ago, and none in Colorado, but saying, pretty amazing things to potential donors. I heard of one donor I worked with had a social worker say to her, this is a crazy thing to want to do, don't you? So it's not like the responses people get are universally positive. However, I just think the more it gets accepted and sort of becomes part of the general consciousness, I think the more people will consider it something they'd be willing to do.
Well, and Dr. Branagan, would you agree with that? Or do you have other thoughts about how we might increase living donation?
Yeah, I think that, recently the Transplant Center put out a call for living donors for the children's recipients, and we were so flooded with potential donors that we cleared the list of needed recipients. And, I had very busy weeks of evaluating all these folks for donation. And really the truth is that the people were out there. They weren't created by this need. They were out there, as Dr. Marsh has said, they were, in that continuum of altruism. And for many people, they may not even realize that they can donate to a stranger, or there's so many people who come in to become liver donors and don't realize that you can donate a lobe of your liver. And part of it is getting the word out there about the need, about the opportunity to donate. And then I think as we develop other techniques, whether it's using robotic organ donation as a less invasive and lower risk option that has a faster recovery time for patients, I think that these types of things are the aspects that will change donation, the capability for people to donate. And, there are so many people who I've met with who, in my mind, are altruistic donors, but for a medical reason could not donate. And so I'm thinking of the person who never even knew that they congenitally had a solitary kidney until we put them through the CT scan and said, well, you can't donate because you only have one in the first place. You're doing great, so keep up the good work, kind of thing. And so, that person is just as altruistic in many ways, but they just have medical reasons why they aren't able to donate.
Well, and since you brought up the recent children's call for action, that was pretty phenomenal. Did any of those donors end up not matching for children, but want to donate to adults or come back later as a potential donor?
Yeah, I think so. And really that's, I think, the attitude that people bring with them to their donor evaluation is that it would be really great to change a child's life. And really with donating to a child, it can be a lifelong change for that person. And you have so many more years to maximize the benefit of this donation. But the attitude of these potential donors is that I just want to help someone. And the truth is that even for people who are able to donate to an adult, it ends up benefiting a child because all patients are sadly competing for the same pool of organs. And so it's a net benefit to all people on all wait lists.
Well, I want to thank you both, Dr. Branagan and Dr. Marsh, for having this fascinating discussion and sharing your expertise. I appreciate your time and thank you again.
Thanks for having me.